After that, I branched out into something that's a little new for me. I read Korean manga, which I guess you call manhwa instead, if I'm not mistaken. But this is something that is also welcome in the manga cafe. So I read this one called The Horizon, and it was an interesting experience because, I'll have to talk about both the story material and the formatting of it. Basically, I read it because it came recommended as a really good sort of horror series, which it is. Basically, it's about two small children who are sort of caught in a post-apocalyptic setting of sorts. This was back in January when I read it, so I might be a little fuzzy on the details, but it seems like it's a sort of apocalypse that was mostly like the world has destroyed itself through countless wars. And it's about these two kids who just, they find each other in the world and they just say, we're going to keep on walking towards the horizon until we kind of figure out what our life is supposed to be next. And at first it kind of seems like it's just going to be like, these kids walk along and just kind of encounter horror after horror. Like, first they meet this, like, zombie-like man who follows them everywhere and, like, steals their food and bullies them. And, they kind of spend a while trying to figure out how they can get away from this guy, or, like, do they need to kill him for their own survival? And later on, they find their way into a ruined city that is kind of presided over this one man in a suit who has, like, set up traps all over the city to keep looters away. And he kind of takes care of them for a little while and puts them through a lot of morally gray tests of conscience, that kind of thing. But the story as a whole is just, like, very emotionally brutal. Parts of it are really hard to read. Like, the backstory of the main little girl is just, like, absolutely devastating, as she was traveling with this group of people who kind of one by one come down with this highly contagious and highly fatal disease, until through various circumstances she finds herself completely alone until she met the little boy from the beginning. It's good if you want to read something, like, extremely emotionally heavy, to just, like, put yourself to the test of how much you can endure. And then, like, by the end of it, there was a weird moment of, like, some overtly Christian imagery that seemed to come out of nowhere, but I don't know, like, the final message of the story seemed to be like, well, it'll all be okay if we can just accept Christ into our lives. Now, I mentioned I had to talk about the formatting, and so this was a webtoon originally. I have never read a webtoon online. Like, I've read web comics, but nowadays I know, like, webtoon specifically is this, like, massive online entity where, like, a lot of comic creators are putting their whole careers online through it. But we're seeing more and more books coming into bookstores, including the Manga Cafe, that will have a webtoon logo on it, or say, like, webtoon unscrolled. And that is, if you're relatively unfamiliar with webtoon like I am, I believe that comes from the fact that webtoons are usually in just a vertical scrolling format, because that's a format that's easy to read on phones and, like, mobile devices, because that's kind of where it's intended to be read, more so than, like, on your PC or some other device. That being said, it makes for a really awkward transition into book format. So, as I was reading this, and, I'm gonna have a really hard time finding, like, example images to put in my background like I usually do, but I could tell as I'm looking at the pages that, like, clearly some of the panels had been, like, upscaled to fit better on the page. Like, and clearly they were taken from, like, a not very high resolution version of the artwork and then just kind of blown up, and so some of the panels look very pixelated, and it, like, stood out to me immediately. I mean, somebody who doesn't really know much of anything about digital art might not even notice this, But another thing that was like kind of a big problem with it was that sometimes the artwork, if it was, a double page spread, like key parts of the artwork would get lost in the gutter between the pages. Like one that stood out to me particularly, even all these months after reading it, was, an image of that character, the man in the suit, kind of like standing over, looking over the cityscape. And when I got to that page, at first I thought it was just an illustration of a cityscape, and I could barely see the man standing in the center of the image because it just got lost in the gutter between the pages. So, I read this whole series. It's only 3 books long, and, I would recommend it to people if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. But I don't know if I can, like, wholeheartedly recommend buying the books just because they were so weirdly printed. So I don't know, I would say maybe just read that on Webtoon, assuming, that is still a good way to support the artist. If you really, really love it, I would say, buy the books, and then that means more money going to the artist. But hey, that much is up to you. Personally, I think the books were not a very high standard, not very high quality. Alright, now I talked briefly about another manga I was reading recently called Dragon Head. And anyway, I finished reading all of Dragon Head. It's a pretty short series, I think only like 10 or 11 volumes. And I was reading this one because it came recommended as like kind of a modern horror classic. I heard that it was like this really great, really striking post-apocalypse horror manga. Like, it always seemed to come up in the discussion when horror manga was on the table. I was not all that satisfied with it, honestly. The premise, at the very beginning, it's about a class of students who are on a train coming back from a field trip, and there's a tunnel collapse, and their train derails, and most of the class just dies instantly, and it's about, like, 3 students who survived, trying to escape the tunnel, and they're like losing their minds from like the darkness and the loneliness and the hunger that starts to set in and everything. And to make a long story short, they do get back out into the surface world, and they find out that the whole world has basically gone to hell. And it's due, as far as I could tell, to like natural disasters. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions happening, all kinds of things like that. Anyway, I didn't really find most of the story very interesting. It's mostly just the characters trying to go from, city to city or area to area, finding more survivors to see if anyone can help them, find out if their families are okay, and just disaster after disaster keeps happening. Like, here's another earthquake happening, or like, oh, they found their way into this city, but every single person still living in that city has gone absolutely mad and thinks that they need to sacrifice the outsiders in order to stop more storms happening. And most of the chapters are just about the characters trying to escape danger. There's not a lot of like story advancement except like, oh, now they're running away from this, now they're running away from that. There's one chapter, or maybe it was even like multiple chapters, where a few characters are like in a helicopter and they discover this huge chasm that has opened up in the ground, and they're kind of like taking the helicopter down lower into the chasm, and for like pages and pages and pages, it's just characters going, whoa, it's so dark. This pit is so deep. Whoa, it's so dark. This is so scary. It's so dark. This pit is so deep. Wow, so dark. And I'm on, I'm on my tablet reading this, and I'm just like, yep, I get it. Yep, big hole. Yep, dark. Yeah, really goes down far. Yep, big hole. Close to the very end of the story, like in some of the very last chapters, they get to like kind of an interesting concept. It just barely touches on kind of an interesting concept, where they meet these characters who had been part of a medical experiment to basically remove their instinct of fear. And it gets like very briefly philosophical about this idea of maybe without an instinct of fear, human lives could just lose all meaning. And then it's like, well, then another earthquake happened, and everybody had to escape the earthquake that happened again. And then it just kind of ends. So, yeah, I don't know, not really recommended. It's not like the art was like especially stunning either. I mean, it was not bad. But, you know, sometimes if the art is good enough in a series, I would say read it just for that reason, but this isn't really one of those occasions for me. One thing that was kind of fun about reading this was, this is a series that has never been, like, officially published in English, and so I was having to read it online and read fanlations, which is always a fun time. This one especially was translated through like 3 different languages, I think. It was something like Japanese into German, into French, into English, things like that. And so like little vestiges of the previous languages kind of held through into the English translation. Like sometimes just very strange sound effect text. Like a really big repeating one was Brrlom. I don't really know what sound Brrlom is supposed to be, and I don't know if that's like a German or French sound effect or what it is, but I saw a lot of Brrlom, and I could not help but laugh at it every time. I read a single volume manga this year called Taking Care of God. This was another series where I was looking through each publisher's list of upcoming manga titles, and this one kind of caught my eye. You know, generally anything that doesn't have an obnoxious isekai title, or say like volume 23 of a series, will catch my eye. And this one didn't even say volume 1, you know, indicating to me that it was a standalone book, which is pretty uncommon. And you know, it's easier to commit to a single book than it is to like commit to the idea of starting a new series. Now, I liked this one pretty well because it was, you know, like a regular old speculative sci-fi story, and it's by, you know, an actual like sci-fi novel author, so it was something that was kind of detached from a lot of the tropes you tend to see in a lot of other manga, and that made it like kind of an interesting read. I also really liked the art style, but I don't know that the artist who illustrated it is even known for any other major works of manga. The premise basically is that one day this massive fleet of spaceships appears in orbit around Earth, and they send all of these like elderly aliens down to the planet, and you find out that these elderly aliens were like the progenitors of all life on Earth, and they have now returned to Earth in their old age because it's where they want to retire. And a lot of it is just kind of logistically about how, like, so many families all across the Earth were assigned an alien to take care of, and they're given, like, a large government stipend to help with that, which is made possible because these aliens are, like, sharing a lot of their technology with Earth now, and causing, like, a massive economic boom. And the main character is this, like, mute little girl who ran into one of the aliens by accident one day when she was like just out in the woods, and she like threw a rock at him and like nearly killed him. And you know, plot twist is that her family ends up taking care of that very alien that she mistakenly attacked in shock. Overall, I'm like, it was a pretty good read. I mean, it wasn't so good that I felt compelled to buy that one book. I kind of felt like it lost me a little as it went into the ending. I mean, it kind of becomes about how, like, over time, relations with these aliens living on Earth kind of become strained, and I don't know, I don't want to give away too much about the ending, I guess, in case anybody else feels compelled to read this. You don't want the surprise ruined. But I don't know, I mean, personally, I don't know, it didn't leave me with that profound of a feeling once I got to the end of it. I was just like, well, that's kind of interesting, I guess. It didn't really, like, shake my world. But, you know, for just a single 200-ish page volume, it was still, you know, a pretty unique experience, and I enjoyed a lot of the ride along the way. Not to mention it having a cool art style. Makes this, you know, kind of a mild recommendation for me. I was like, it's pretty good. Yeah, read it if you're into that kind of thing. Kind of briefly, I want to mention I did, in fact, buy the deluxe hardcover edition of My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, which I had brought up briefly in my last recap. And I did reread that. If you've not heard me talk about it before, it is just like a really fascinating memoir manga about somebody kind of figuring out their gender and sexual identity and going into like a lot of deep introspective analysis of like their, you know, emotions and feelings. The way I described it in the past is like this person's memoirs are just kind of like so devastating that I love reading them. They are like a very high priority read when they come out, but at the same time I kind of hope that more don't come out, because she only tends to make manga when she's going through something really horrible in life. And so, you know, it's one of those like no news is good news kind of situations where it's like, well, you know, she hasn't put out a memoir manga in a while. Maybe that means she doesn't have a lot of trauma that she's going through these days. I'll take that to mean she's doing fine. And I am happier for that to be the case than for her to be putting out a whole bunch of memoir manga about a whole bunch of other traumatic events that have happened. Alright, now this is the last thing that I have bought this year so far, and it's a really interesting example. Something that is, I don't know, it's in a genre all to itself in a way. It's the kind of thing I never really talk about. Anyway, this manga is called Sazan and Comet Girl, and it's hard to say where to begin with this because it's so unlike anything else I've ever read. I had never heard of it before in my life. I just kind of saw it sitting on the shelf one day, you know, just saw this spine, and it was eye-catching for various reasons. One thing is that it was larger than your average, like, 200-page volume of manga. It was not a volume 1. It was, you know, clearly a standalone product. Just I had never heard of it before. And I've been feeling like nowadays there isn't a whole lot of, like, sci-fi spacefaring manga coming out. There's a lot more of, like, contemporary urban fantasy stuff like Dan to Dan and Jujutsu Kaisen, My Hero Academia, Chainsaw Man. And, you know, there's plenty of isekai. There's more isekai than you can shake a stick at to give you, like, medieval fantasy settings. But there's not a lot of, like, just hard sci-fi manga coming out. There's not a lot of, like, space opera kind of stuff. I mean, except for, like, some of your old genre standbys, like, you know, there's always a new Gundam, that kind of thing. Seems like there's always a new Macross, even though the only one you really need to care about is the original series. But some other things caught my eye about this. So when I picked it up off the shelf, it was a little heavier than normal. You know, it's heavier than a volume of this size looks. Part of that is that 7 Seas, which published this one, seems to use a higher quality paper for a lot of their publications, and that in turn makes their volumes a little heavier. But I was looking at the side of it, and I noticed something really unusual, which is that I did not see black and white and gray lines on the outside. Because as it turns out... Whoa! That's right, this entire manga is in full color. It's all, like, illustrated in watercolor. And not only that, I mean, it's extremely colorful too. It's absolutely beautiful. And so, I bought it, knowing basically nothing about it beforehand, just because that is such an oddity to see. Like, I knew I wanted to own it just because of how uncommon that is. And I'm like, I cannot imagine how much time it must have taken to watercolor every single page of this manga, and do it so beautifully even. And, you know, I can describe the story to you, but it almost feels irrelevant in the face of just, like, how unusually and how beautifully this was crafted. But it's a pretty light-hearted space adventure romp. Tonally, it kind of feels like something that might be in a Studio Ghibli movie, where it's like, you know, it'll briefly touch on one or two heavy subjects, but for the most part it's fun, light-hearted, whimsical fantasy adventure in outer space. Like, the main character is kind of an everyman who has a job, like, terraforming small planet homes for people. He works for this, like, dinosaur alien boss who is just an absolutely adorable design. And one day, the Comet girl just happens to fly into his life and sweeps him off his feet and leads him off on grand adventures. And she is a pretty good analogy you could give to her is she's kind of like Adamusk in Fooly Cooly, how she's this kind of like legendary outer space figure who holds enormous power, and so a lot of people are seeking her across the universe because they want to, like, harness her power or use her as a weapon or what have you. But Sazan, the main character, he's the only guy who has ever seen her as a person and to actually care about her as a person and not as a tool or a weapon. And so, you know, he kind of forms this unlikely ragtag team with a couple other, like, alien guys, and they go flying across the universe to try and, like, help her and rescue her and save her. And, you know, I feel like that's pretty much the bulk of the story, you know? That's pretty much what you need to know. And I recommend reading this. I mean, it's a fairly, like, surface-level story, but it is just so beautiful. And, you know, a large part of that is just the fact that it is full color, but I mean, the coloration of it is so absolutely well done. Every single page is just a feast for the eyes. And, you know, the characters are all pretty fun and lovable. But really, like, with a book like this, the story just kind of has to be serviceable, which it is, in order to be a vessel for these just, like, stunningly gorgeous illustrations on every single page. I have talked earlier in this recap about how sometimes a manga's artwork is strong enough that I think that alone is reason enough to read it or buy it, even if it has a weak story. And this is 100% one of those occasions where it is such an absolutely gorgeous treat to look at that alone is reason to buy it and read it. I've got a couple more things that I read recently that are not in print in English. And kind of a interesting backstory on these next couple. I read these because in my last recap, I talked about Taco P's Original Sin, which was a standalone manga that I bought, and I described it as being in the genre of, bro, are you okay? So somebody saw that video and joined my Discord and made some manga recommendations to me that were in kind of a similar vein. And I don't remember that user's name offhand, so I'll probably edit it onto the screen at this point of the video. But they made, I think, like 4 or 5 manga recommendations to me, and I added most or all of them to my plan to read list, mostly because all of them were, like, pretty short, and it's like, you know, I can take an hour or two of time to read some recommendations like that. Anyway, the first one that I read was Kami no Kodomo, or Child of God, or Children of God. This was kind of the first one that I gravitated toward because I've actually seen people across the internet, you know, on like Discord or Twitter or whatever, who have like profile icons from this manga. And so I was like, well, okay, if there are some people out there who love this enough to make it their profile picture, then maybe this is something that will resonate. And this one was very short. I mean, it's a single volume. I think it was like 11 chapters in total, maybe. And it was basically about a kid growing up and becoming a serial killer. And it's all about just kind of like his psychological development and, you know, his lack of emotions and how he's like not able to relate to other people and like doesn't see value in other people, that kind of thing. And, you know, like basically once he gets into his teenage years, he forms what is practically a cult, and they decide to like start committing random murders and basically become this like murder cult club. And also they have lots of gay sex with each other. So there's that. I don't know, maybe I should give like a spoiler warning, but I mean, I feel like for a story that's only like 11 chapters long, there's not that much to spoil. Before I do that, though, like, a really striking thing about this manga, obviously, is its, like, very unique art style. You'll hardly see a single thing that looks like this. If I could compare it to anything, it might be a little bit like Panorama of Hell. That artist's kind of works, but even then, it's, like, a little different from that. It kind of looks like, I don't know, like an ancient traditional kind of art, like something that you would see on, like, an ancient tapestry or something like that. It's just like very stylized and like methodical, not like realistic and not cartoony either. Anyway, to talk about kind of how it ends, if you care about spoilers at all, then like skip ahead to the next video chapter. So he's, you know, got this like serial killer cult going, and by the end eventually he like becomes jealous of one of his cult members who decided to leave and have a girlfriend and be normal instead. And so they kill the girlfriend, and then that guy comes back to get revenge on the main character and kills him. And for most of the manga, it feels like it's just this kind of indulgent dive into the psyche of a psychopath. And it just kind of like presents like this character's life story in kind of a dispassionate way of just like, well, here's when I first decided to murder somebody, and here's what I felt when I murdered somebody for the first time. And by the end, like the very last page had this weird moment of like, well, that's how I died, so everybody else, make sure you stay vigilant because there could always be more people like me in the world. I don't know, at the very end it became this weird kind of like moral statement of like what this character did was wrong and we should all watch out for these kind of behaviors so we make sure this doesn't happen again, even though, you know, it's a fictional account. It almost makes me wonder like if the artist was told by whoever was publishing this manga like, hey, you need to like course correct this and, you know, let the readers know that what's happening in the story is wrong, or we're gonna just have to stop it. And then it stopped. I don't know. I mean, that's just my wild speculation based on nothing. That's just kind of the vibe that I got. Would I recommend it to other people? I mean, it's only like 11 chapters long. You try it for yourself, you know. You won't waste too much time if you read it and you hate every minute of it. I mean, I will say, you know, I obviously wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but people who are interested in, like, kind of dark psychological stories like that, and, you know, at least want to see a unique, striking art style, then, you know, I'd recommend it to that kind of person. The second series that I read based on that user's recommendation was Hepatica. It also has a second name that it goes by, and I don't remember what that name was, but I'll put that on screen too. I wasn't sure which title was the Japanese one and which one was like a translated title. The person pitched this story to me as a revenge style on the level of something like Kill Bill, but they think it's even better than Kill Bill. And now, I don't know if I would go that far, but it is a revenge story, and this manga kind of does its own thing in a lot of really interesting and artistic ways. This was also like not a very long one, but I think like maybe 3 or 4 volumes in total. I think I read the whole thing in one afternoon. But I did see like a lot of parallels between this and like Taco P's Original Sin. I could see how they have very similar vibes. Both of those manga have a lot to do with like middle school kids getting just savagely bullied. It's like to the point where I genuinely have to question, like, does this kind of shit actually go on? Like, do kids really bully each other to like this extent? Because I mean, they're doing shit like, you know, like actually stabbing each other and like doing grievous harm to each other. And the thing that kind of sets off this whole story in this manga is like some kids decide to burn down another kid's house and like kill most of her family in doing so. And so after that, which, you know, I think happens in the first chapter or so, it becomes largely a revenge story about her going on with her life and one by one killing off all of the classmates who bullied her. That description might make it sound like kind of just a base level revenge story and like there's not anything too deep about it. It is like pretty gruesome and like horrifying, especially seeing this kind of stuff happening among kids. But like I mentioned at the beginning, there are some artistic touches to it that I really like. I mean, personally, I do like the art style itself pretty well. I think that's unique and appealing in its own way. But the story is also like thematically interesting in a few ways. Like, pretty much the whole story takes place during winter, and the title of the manga is derived from this flower that I forget what it was. I think it like it only blooms in the winter, or like it survives through the winter and then will bloom in the spring, that kind of thing. I'm a little hazy on those details. But a thing that I really liked is that it is set up that this class of middle school students is going to be the last class of students that graduate from this specific school, because it takes place in kind of a small town, and it is framed against cultural setting of like the declining birth rate in Japan. And it's this idea that, you know, there are not enough children in this town to justify keeping the school open, so after this class graduates, they're going to shut down this school forever. And that in itself was kind of an interesting backdrop because, you know, from my own life experiences, I've never heard of a school being shut down because, you know, they're run by the government most of the time and there are always more kids who need to go to school. You know, I hear about new schools opening all the time, but, you know, you never hear about the need for a school declining to the point that the school is going to be shut down. And it kind of gave the whole story this kind of like looming sense of death because, you know, it's about this school as an institution dying off at the same time that the kids themselves are dying off. You know, there's this grim looming air over the whole thing of just everything slowly dying. And I think that kind of atmosphere really elevates it beyond just being a story about a bullied kid getting revenge on her bullies. And so, you know, while it is entertaining seeing these like weird and indulgent scenes of like horrible violent revenge, especially as like some of these kids get into a mentality of like, we need to kill this girl before she kills us because she's trying to kill everybody. Like, the story left me with a lot more than that because you have so many of these elements contributing to that dark and heavy atmosphere that made it a lot more striking than just violent revenge story. I don't know if I would say I enjoy it more than a movie like Kill Bill, but it was definitely really memorable and unique. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making it to the end of another video. Special thanks to the financial supporters of Trooth's Manga Cafe listed here. For our audience question this time, Joe asks coffee or tea? Now that's a pretty good question. I feel like if I was visiting your house and you offered me either coffee or tea, I'd probably say tea. But in my personal life, I probably drink coffee a lot more often. Like, I actually can't tell you the last time I drank tea. It's probably been months. But I drink coffee, like, several times a week. Like, most days I have at least 1 cup of coffee. I should probably buy and drink more tea. Anyway, leave a comment down below if you too would like an audience question answered in the next episode, or you can join my Discord and I might draw a question from there. Anyway, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.